Kathleen.
Thanks so much for having us here, Ashley. I'm Kathleen McSweeney, and I've lived here in Arlington for 32 years. And with me is Alicia Jones-McLeod. Alicia?
So, yes, hi, I'm Alicia Jones-McLeod, the Executive Director of Challenging Racism. I am very happy to be here today to talk to you about our organization and some of the ideas about past housing discrimination in Arlington.
Thank you.
Dun, dun, dun. Fantastic.
Great.
Okay, did we lose Kathleen's face?
You did, but that's fine.
Okay,
Okay.
sorry, just wanted to make sure. So one of the things that we wanted to start with was say that there are a number of reasons that people come to this work. So at Challenging Racism, I'll just spend a moment talking a little bit about what we do. Challenging Racism, we are an organization that creates safe spaces to disrupt the conversation about racism. We want to help people lead an anti-racist life, as it says, and that is really our charge, to educate and provide these spaces to practice, to gain knowledge, to listen to others, really to make sure that we're sharing stories that are impactful and that can change the conversation so that we all are aware of the impact of our words and can use that to create this anti-racist society, which is our goal. And today, everyone has come to to this work to at a different place. So we don't know what your goals are, but they can be like gaining knowledge and learning more about others and their stories and the past and the history of Arlington. We're here to help you with any of the goals that you might have come to us with, and also to increase understanding to make sure that we're all on the same page when we have these tough conversations.
So these are the topics we're going through. We just wanted to provide a little bit of a background. We'll talk about pre-18th century. I know that this congregation is very interested in the people who came before us. 19th century, we'll talk about land grants, Freedmen's Village, and Black property owners in neighborhoods. We'll move into the 20th century with de facto versus de jure segregation. We'll talk about deed covenants, eminent domain, real estates, and FHA practices. And then we'll end talking about today's challenges here in Arlington. Alicia, I'll hand it back to you. Okay,
so I just want to make a note. I don't think we're changing slides on the screen.
There we go.
There we go. So we're going to start with pre-18th century. And we know that the pre-18th century, that there were Native people on these lands, Indigenous cultures, and people that were already here. So we didn't found Arlington. We might have renamed it, but it was already a working community of Indigenous cultures before other people came and decided to build great affordable housing or other things on it. This was already a land of people that were here and living, and a community. And Arlington Historical Society reports evidence of the Clovis people throughout the area. So this is a prehistory going back many, many years. So So what we understand is that this congregation acknowledges the people who were here on this land before us. For thousands of years, Indigenous nations lived relatively uninterrupted in Virginia and in the Americas, not just in Virginia, until the first European settlers came in the 1500s. At that time, 3 tribes, the Powhatan, the Monacan, and the Cherokee, were the most prevalent in Virginia. Prior to the 17th century, Arlington was home to Native Americans who were linguistically related to other cultures and culturally related to the Piscataway tribe in Maryland. During that time, much of the central Arlington is depicted on historic maps as a forested area, home to elk, deer, bear, turkeys, a variety of other woodland animals hunted by the locals for food. So these were significant villages. and the nearest to the Columbia Pike area was located in the vicinity of Gravelly Point. In the 1600s, 1607, 1608, the native people of the region traded with Captain John Smith. I'm sure people have heard of that name, when he sailed up the Potomac. 2 years later, another crew led by Captain Argyle followed the same route, but were rebuffed when they attempted to trade. Captain Argyle and his crew attacked and burned the village in response. Additional pressure was applied to the people here of the Iroquois Nation, and advancing into the area of the north, the Powhatan Confederacy advancing from the south, and European settlers approaching on their territory, encroaching on their territory. Bacon's rebellion in 1675 ultimately led to the system of forcing tribal people onto reservations here in Virginia. And by 1679, the area was no longer home to Native American villages.
If you want to continue, Alicia?
Sure. The 19th century, we had Freedmen's Village and Black property owners in neighborhoods. So Freedmen's Village was Arlington's first planned neighborhood with 1.5-story duplexes and housing for formerly enslaved people. Freedmen's Village was founded in 1863. This was ordered by the Secretary of War and established by Robert E. Lee's estate. Arlington House, also known as the Custis Mansion, which had enslaved at least 70 people on the estate prior to the war. The families living in Freedmen's Village paid rent, established churches and schools. The government attempted to close Freedmen's Village several times. In 1888, John Syphax, whose mother had been enslaved in Arlington, wrote to the secretary on behalf of the residents to negotiate settlements for improvements made to the properties in Freedmen's Village. It was closed in 1900 to make way for Arlington National Cemetery, another name I'm sure we're familiar with, but residents did receive compensation. Many of those relocated families moved to East Arlington, the site of the present-day Pentagon. Mount Olive Baptist Church purchased land for homes and the church, and the subdivision was known as Queen City and was populated by African-American homeowners. When the Pentagon was built, Queen City residents were forcibly relocated and their lands were taken by eminent domain. They received compensation, but some ended up moving to Green Valley and others were forced out of the county. So we have a list here of some of Arlington's Black neighborhoods, including Halls Hill, Butler Homes, Arlington View, and Green Valley. Those areas were settled in the dates that were listed, and these were the only neighborhoods in which Black families could purchase property from 1865 to 1965. So I'm just going to make a note, 100 years where these were the only places that they could live. Racial covenants made other properties completely off limits. And these areas were redlined by the FHA in the 20th century.
Can you say something about the racial covenant? What might that horribleness?
We're actually going to show you one.
Oh, great. Okay.
In just a minute.
Yes. Is this still me?
I can take over from here. So we're just going to go through very quickly through a few of the neighborhoods that we just talked about. So Halls Hills, a wall, I think many of us know, a wall had been erected on 3 sides in the 1930s by white neighbors to basically, it was just sort of protect their properties. It was also a result of, some of the redlining that we'll talk about in a minute. So they didn't want their properties to be kind of downgraded, and they wanted to get mortgages. So they built a wall so that their Black neighbors could not come over into their neighborhood. The last remnants of the wall were knocked down in last year's flooding. Mm-hmm. For some people was kind of a good moment out of all that terrible flooding. It was founded after the Civil War by Basil Hall. It was nearly 300 acres sold to formerly enslaved persons for $10 to $15 an acre. Some of you know Halls Hills because Fire Station 8 was opened in 1918, and it's still a source of pride for the community because it was the county's first Black fire station, and it was started out as all volunteer. Wilma Jones, also, who some of you may know, her family lived in Halls Hills for generations, and she published a book about the history in her family called My Halls Hill Family, More Than a Neighborhood. The next Black neighborhood that had been founded is Butler Homes. Butler Homes is actually, first of all, William Butler and Henry Lewis Holmes, they purchased 13 acres of the Hunter Plantation. and they subdivided it for Black homeowners. They were Black men. They held positions in the county. Butler was the commissioner of roads, and Hunter was commissioner of the revenue for several years. Dr. Charles Drew, a lot of us know that name as well. There's an elementary school in Arlington named after him. He grew up in this neighborhood, and many descendants of original families still live here. It's now known as Penrose, and these are the original homes of Mr. Butler and Mr. Holmes, shown above. Arlington View and Johnson's Hill. So this is over on Columbia Pike, right up from the congregation, actually. Mm-hmm. The historic Johnson Hill neighborhood, formed in part from Freedman's Village, is at the far east end of Columbia Pike. There are numerous historic homes, and the Hoffman Boston Elementary School was actually the African-American high school during the years of segregation here in Arlington. It was, I mentioned that it was formed from Freedman's Village. And it was a farm subdivided into 4 parts, 3 of which were sold to former enslaved persons in the late 1800s. Harry Gray purchased a northwest corner and built Arlington's first townhouse at South Quinn Street. Gray learned masonry at the Custis House, where his father and his mother, Thornton and Selina, were enslaved. Gray's plot was subdivided and became Arlington View. So the Arlington View neighborhood is what it goes by now. And descendants of the Gray family still, I believe, live in the community today. Before the Pentagon was built, this community was connected to the Queens community that was down by the river on the Pentagon grounds. Green Valley, formerly Nauck. Some of you may know that this name has gone back and forth a couple of times, but they have now reclaimed their name of Green Valley, the folks who live there. The, Green Valley was founded by free Black people, Levi and Sarah Ann Jones. They were landowners prior to the Civil War, and they built their home in 1844. John D. Nauck Jr., who was actually from across the river in DC, bought land and subdivided it in 1874. Since Black families were excluded from full participation in mainstream political and social life, the residents provided their own institutions, churches. They have Lomax AME Zion, Mount Zion Baptist Church, Macedonia Baptist Church, that are all still there today. They're very old congregations. And Our Lady of Queen of Peace was also founded there. There were schools, the Kemper School, which was the all-Black school, and then Drew Elementary, which was also the all-Black elementary school for many years. And there was also a pharmacy. A lot of people, I think, remember Doc Muse, who ran the pharmacy for many, many years and unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Drew Elementary had been closed after neighborhood students were bused out of the neighborhood to other elementary schools. So in 1971, Drew Elementary ceased to exist as a Black-only school. That was in the days when we were trying to integrate schools, and busing was the answer. So the Drew Model School was created as a county-wide choice school to draw white families from outside the neighborhood boundaries. And then the predominantly Black neighborhood students were bused to other elementary schools in far north Arlington, with a goal that those transfers of African-American students did not make those schools' population fall below 7% or go above 19% of Black students. They had this number they were trying to achieve. And then in 1987, the model school was basically merged with a regular neighborhood program again, under one roof, at the insistence of Green Valley residents who said they wanted their own elementary school, and they didn't understand why their kids needed to be bused all over Arlington. So it was an effort to end the busing and have a neighborhood serving elementary school. And so, as you may know, the model school actually last year was pulled out from Drew Elementary, and now it is once again a neighborhood school. Other notable things in Green Valley, Jenny Dean Park served as the only baseball diamond and park open to African-American children for many, many years. As such, it is very important and has been recognized, and the county has a lot of plans to improve it. There has been a planning process underway to reimagine all of the 4 Mile Run Valley, which is right there where Green Valley is. And there's a long-term plan for many improvements, including improvements to Jenny Dean Park. The Town Square project in Green Valley is nearing completion. It is notable, and I'll probably talk about it later, residents of Green Valley have not always felt included or heard as part of that planning process. Now we'll talk about deed covenants and real estate and FHA practices, and really the history of redlining. So first I wanted to give a couple of definitions. So de facto segregation is concentrations of people that result from maybe private prejudices, private discriminatory practices, personal choices, and income differences. Basically, it sort of happens naturally and accidentally is the idea, but it keeps families out based on income and race. De jure segregation results from government law and policy that violates the 5th, 13th, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. And the Supreme Court has said in previous rulings that de facto segregation has very few remedies because it resulted from accidents and not by design. But if segregation has been created de jure, or de jure, due to explicit racist policies, we are required to remedy it. And so we're going to talk about the racist policies that have been in part of our institutions and that in fact make the segregation that we have here in Arlington and throughout the rest of the United States de jure segregation. So you asked about restricted deed covenants. So I'm showing you the one that's right across the street from me. I live in Lyon Park. And so we have a community house, and a portion of the 1925 Lyon Park deed says very clearly, and I have it highlighted, neither said property nor any part thereof nor any interest therein shall be loaned, sold, or leased to anyone not of the Caucasian race for a period of 99 years from September 1st, 1923. So in Lyon Park, it was developed by Fitch and Lyon, two very well-to-do people who bought a lot of land and subdivided it and created a lot of homes. And almost all the homes, actually all the homes they created in Lyon Park, Ashton Heights, and Lyon Village, and in other parts of Arlington, in the early, turn of the century up to about the 1925, had this covenant in it. In fact, all of my neighbors' houses had this covenant in it. And so it's important for us to know that these covenants remain on deeds today. Some homeowners, of course, aren't aware of them. People don't really read all their deed usually. And of those that are, some of my neighbors have actually chosen to have the deed modified so that the covenant no longer appears on the deed, while other families have decided to leave the covenants in place as an historical artifact so that the history isn't forgotten. Now we're going to talk about real estate and FHA practices. So we don't operate in a vacuum. Of course, there were a lot of federal policies that influenced what was happening in Arlington. So due to housing losses during the Depression, as part of the New Deal, there was a lot of public housing that was built for working class families. A lot of people had lost their houses, but these were separated by race as a matter of practice. The public housing for Black families was generally placed in high poverty, isolated neighborhoods. And housing applicants were screened to be sure they were acceptable in the white neighborhoods. So acceptable were things like you had to have a marriage certificate, you had to be married, your children had to be well behaved. I'm not sure who decided that, but your children had to be well behaved. And there were a whole list of things that people had to meet to be able to move into neighborhoods. So then New Deal established the Federal Housing Administration and also some other groups like the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They color-coded maps in cities across the country indicating where it was safe to insure mortgages. So properties seeking mortgages that were near or in African-American neighborhoods were deemed high risk. They were colored red. And the FHA had adopted this map, so that also meant that they would not secure those mortgages. The underwriting manual of the FHAs at the time stated, incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. If that isn't de jure segregation, I don't know what is. Also, they recommended that highways separate Black and white neighborhoods. So there was actually, this was not accidental. There were actually rules for how neighborhoods were supposed to develop. The GI Bill was available for returning soldiers, but Black families really couldn't take advantage of it to build wealth since their white counterparts did because of the covenants and the redlining and the overall lack of options for buying homes in communities. The police in many cities enforced segregation and supported mobs that tried to drive Black families out of white neighborhoods if they did actually buy. Realtors enforced a code of ethics that prevented sales of homes to Black families in certain areas. And studies have shown that real estate agents, there actually was a commission at one point, have shown that real estate agents in Arlington steered Black families to South Arlington neighborhoods in the 1950s through the 80s. And that was something I read in the Center for Virginia History. So now let's look at some of these maps. This is actually a map of Arlington. And you see the colors, it's called redlining because they basically colored the Black neighborhoods red. And those were the areas that the FHA would not insure. And so those in this map, it's a 1971 era map, the red lines or the red neighborhoods were valued at about $20,000. The homes were valued at about $20,000, and compared to the homes in the whiter neighborhoods that were valued between $40,000 and $50,000. They're the purple and blue, and you see sort of the distribution. And you know, thinking about the map we showed you before, where our Black neighborhoods were, they overlap definitely. And so, you know, Arlington definitely has a history of racial segregation and inequality. There was displacement in the form of forced relocations of African-American families from Freedmen's Village first, then to Queens City. I didn't actually mention Roslyn, but there were a bunch of raids in Roslyn, actually by Frank Lyon. He led this Good Citizens Brigade, and it was to clean up Roslyn. But what it effectively did was also clean out the African-American families that lived there. Physical barriers, we talked about the wall in Halls Hills. There are street patterns in Johnson's Hill, Green Valley, and Halls Hills, where the streets are very crooked. They're only one way. There's only one way in and one way out. It was made to be difficult to navigate, and also so you couldn't get into the rest of the neighborhoods around you. There was disenfranchisement and poll taxes here in Arlington, as there were in many other places in the country in the middle of the 20th century. I mentioned the Good Citizens League and the Roslyn cleanup raids. So we had discrimination that was written into zoning and banking and deed covenants. The American Nazi Party was founded in Arlington in 1959 and 1960. And in fact, until very recently, I think it may have moved, it was still here in Arlington, their headquarters. I think the guy who runs it moved to Alexandria recently. But our past impacts opportunities for African-American families today, and our lack of housing, limited options, and high prices prevent marginalized communities from building wealth. So let's talk a little bit about our current conditions here, and what do we have in place that might still create patterns of segregation, or eliminate the opportunity to increase wealth for families. So this is a picture of Arlington County's comprehensive plan. We have 11 elements. They're interdependent, and they're how we plan for Arlington to be built out. The general land use plan, which is we call the GLUP here in Arlington, it's how we desire areas to develop, and that was adopted in 1961. The elements are updated regularly, and our affordable housing master plan is the newest element, which was adopted in 2015. There was the arrival in Metro in the 1970s. And so Arlington revised the GLUP then to plan for high-rise building within a quarter mile of the Metro. To increase density, it made a lot of sense that you have better transit. But there was a Metro bargain that a lot of people talk about, that they promised to retain the neighborhood character outside of the Metro corridors. And that's really code for to not allow a lot of increased density in those neighborhoods, so that and keep them pretty much the way they are in terms of density, in terms of who lives there. Current conditions, a quarter of Arlington residents live in single-family detached housing, only a quarter, but the majority of our 26 square miles of land is actually in single-family neighborhoods. So we know, and we need to confront how our racist past limits wealth building opportunities here in Arlington. There is a continued segregation of neighborhoods and schools. I think anybody with kids in schools realizes this, that there are some schools that have a very high rate of minority students attending it, as well as low-income free and reduced lunch students attending schools. And there are some that have virtually no percentage of free and reduced lunch, and very few minority students who actually attend. There's a shortage of affordable housing and housing options really at every level here in Arlington. And I did want to mention that there is something called the Destination 2027 report. It talks about 10 years of difference in health disparities depending on what neighborhood you are raised in Arlington, which actually, it's an excellent report, and and everyone should read it. It's rather surprising. It's not something you expect here in Arlington, but it could be, you know, that many of us live right next door or maybe within a neighborhood where they've measured 10 years of difference because of health disparities, 10 years of lifespan difference.
Yeah, I mean, Arlington County Arlington Presbyterian kind of sits in this particular area of some of those neighborhoods where there's
Yes.
a 10-year difference.
Right. Columbia Pike has several neighborhoods. Right down the street from me in Buckingham is another one of the neighborhoods. And so we have some challenges here in Arlington. We're a Dillon Rule state in Virginia, which means that we cannot exercise any authority as a county manager plan of government, which is how we're defined in the Virginia ordinance. We can't exercise any authority that we're not expressly given by the Virginia State Constitution to the state legislature. So there are many things that Arlington, in the past, that the Arlington County Board has passed that the state has slapped it down and basically said, you can't do that because we didn't tell you you could. So that's really the Dillon Rule. We have some opportunities and challenges with our general land use plan because it defines neighborhood character. And when we have conversations about maybe increasing density or doing something a little different at the edges of neighborhoods, we generally see a lot of people from single family neighborhoods show up and talk about this, you know, neighborhood character. We're changing the character of the neighborhood. Upzoning of single family neighborhoods is something that has been talked about recently under the Housing Arlington planning process. And so again, single family neighborhoods are very much against doing upzoning in general. But this is a way that we could increase our affordable housing options in Arlington and just our housing options overall. There are infrastructure considerations, including schools and creating enough of them at the moment. Improved transit and resetting parking expectations is also something, you know, people with cars, again, seem to have an outsized voice in Arlington. And parking becomes a major issue with every site plan that we do here in Arlington. And improving transit, of course, serves people who don't have cars. And yet we've fallen behind, especially on Columbia Pike, with providing transit options. For years, we know the streetcar was something that was being planned. Regardless of what you think of the streetcar, there was a plan for improving transit. And when the streetcar was defunded, there was a promise to bring better bus service along the Pike and more frequent bus service and off-fare boarding, but that hasn't materialized. I understand that there are some, changes in the works now, or there's some construction in the works now, but it's been years. And of course, the people who the transit serves are generally our lower income families who rely on transit to get to work and school. And then there's a Lee Highway Planning Initiative, which is talking about where is it appropriate to increase density. And so, I'm looking, and we all should be looking to this planning process very hopefully, because there is an opportunity, I think, to get a lot more affordable housing along Lee Highway, where there's not a lot right now. So we want to encourage, we want to think about encouraging broad community conversations. What does an equitable Arlington look like? And how does increased density help us achieve goals of creating more affordability here in Arlington? We also might want to think about, zoning and how we could change zoning rules. Right now, there is a zoning rule that says no more than 4 unrelated persons can live in a house. So if 2 families wanted to go in on a house together in a single family neighborhood, that would not actually be legal unless it's zoned for a 2-family house. And there are certain parts of Arlington that are zoned that way, but very few. We should be encouraging pilot projects and build consensus throughout Arlington for additional density. This is sort of the missing middle housing. Now, missing middle does not necessarily mean affordable housing, but by increasing housing options at all levels, we increase our ability to get more affordable housing as well through, creating site plan conditions or as a result of the affordable housing ordinance that we have here in Arlington. I mentioned that Green Valley residents haven't always felt heard during 4-mile Run Valley developments. And I think we as a community need to think about how we engage. The Arlington Way is a great thing, but for those that participate and those that are heard. And so we need to make sure that there are a lot of voices around the table. There's been recent conversation about CIP funding of stormwater. The CIP was just passed, a 1-year CIP. And because of all the storms and because of all the damage that was done, the county has decided to put a lot of money into the CIP and future CIPs for stormwater. I'm sorry, CIP stands for Capital Improvement Project. And so that sounds like a good idea. And in fact, I think it is a good idea because there was a lot of damage done and it's a public safety issue. But there were people who showed up at the CIP hearing who talked about, why is it you can put $50 million into a CIP for stormwater and you can't spend $300,000 to fix sidewalks that need to be fixed or deliver the transit improvements that we've been waiting for. And so, this again is an equity question and that we all can really weigh in on. And I've listed here some of the plans that Arlington has already passed that kind of make incremental change, but we need to continue monitoring these plans to make sure that they realize their potential. And so in terms of working for change, what you can do, or we all can do, is to engage in capital improvement planning and budget conversations, because our budgets are our values in action. The Arlington Way, our much touted way of community participation, we should follow and comment on land use and housing and zoning amendments that take place. The Planning Commission considers these all the time. The Site Plan Review Committee is where a lot of the affordable housing is decided. It's where they're negotiating with the developers. They also run, the Planning Commission also runs a monthly zoning committee meeting to consider zoning amendments. The Housing Commission meets monthly to review affordable housing projects. Tenants have very few rights in Arlington, but we do have a tenant landlord commission, and we do have a local tenants rights organization, Bugada, and both of them really deserve a lot more support in Arlington. The county board, of course, is where the buck stops, and they adopt the recommendations by staff and commissions, and they're the ones in the end that make these decisions. But you should know your commissioners and you should know your county board members. And, also question, does the composition of our commissions, do they represent all of Arlington? And then you should advocate for revisions to the affordable housing ordinance so that developers are better incentivized to build on-site affordable housing. But in every case, we should definitely continue the conversation. And then we've just listed some resources and readings in case people would like to know. It's very heavy on the planning side, but there's some interesting articles in there as well. Alicia, I didn't know if you wanted to do any sort of wrap up in terms of.
I just wanted to say that all of this information we can share readily with you. I believe, Kathleen, is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yes, to make sure that any of the links or the documents that you want to review and get more information on, please dig in deep and let's make sure that Arlington is a more inclusive place for everyone to be a part of.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Pretty incredible.
That was a lot. This was good.
I know that was really dense, right?
Yeah, this is really good. I guess the question that comes to mind is, the story, right? You started really, you went way back, right? 1500s, 1600s.
Right.
And so there's a story narrative to this, obviously that's of long ago and now. And then Kathleen, you put, this is how the story might continue in new ways. And I'm wondering, for both of you, when you look at a place like Gilliam Place and what Arlington Presbyterian did in order, you know, with APA and community partners to create Gilliam Place, where does this sit in the story of this history? You know, what is it saying that where it, you know, I think the story has something to say about this policies as far as, you know, kind of resisting some of the past and creating a new way of being community. But I'm just curious from both of you about how you know, what's the narrative that this story is saying up against the history that you just presented?
So first of all, your story, the story of your congregation is really a remarkable one. The path you took, the very public conversations you were having about, you know, reimagining yourselves and also serving your community is very inspiring. And it also gave a lot of people hope, I think, in terms of the affordable housing community, especially because you were taking land that had been privately owned and used as a church, and now you're housing 173, is it?
Yeah.
Families on that land, and you still have your space, your worship space, but you're also providing services on the first floor of your space as well to serve those families. And so, you know, I thought it's very thoughtful in terms of what you've done. And quite frankly, I think the county and housing advocates are looking to other faith communities to say, hey, you know, a lot of you are sitting on land, and, you know, that could be developed to help solve our problem. And so I think you sort of have led the way with that and are inspiring other people, I hope, to have more conversations about this.
Mm-hmm.
And can I also add that I went to a presentation way before I got this job about Arlington, and basically what it is that you guys have done is taken the house of worship and said, how can we really service the community with the resources that we have? And I was blown away by the idea of taking the land that is there and reallocating it so that you can have housing that is affordable and supports the mission of the church while you support the community. I do think that when you come into a lot of places in the DMV, in this region, there is just no land. We have run out of land in most places. And the land that is left is being set aside for environmental purposes. So we've got to keep this conversation going on how we reallocate the land that we feel is rightfully, you know, we own it. This is ours. But how do we reallocate it to make sure that it's part of the community and doing the best that we can for the community, highest and best use for all members, so that we can create the diverse community that Arlington can be the promise of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.